the morning Emily Carter was supposed to become Jack Sullivan's wife, she knelt on a cold marble floor in a ruined wedding dress while 200 guests watched his family take her apart piece by piece. His mother told her she had never belonged in that cathedral. His sister said the whole family had been laughing at her for months without her ever noticing. And Jack, the man who had spent 4 years telling her that her mind was the most beautiful thing about her, stood back with his arms crossed and let every second of it happen. What none of them understood, what none of them could have possibly understood, was that the woman kneeling in front of them had spent those same 4 years hiding a truth large enough to end every single one of them before the reception ever began. So why did Emily let it happen? And what walked through those cathedral doors 30 seconds later? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily Carter grew up learning that the people who talked the least about their advantages were usually the ones who understood them best, and by the time she reached college, that lesson had become instinct rather than something she consciously practiced. She arrived at Ashbrook University with a single suitcase, a modest dorm assignment, and a reputation that formed within the first semester as the quiet girl who sat in the front row of every economics lecture and rarely spoke, unless a professor called on her directly. Her classmates assumed she was simply gifted, one of those students who absorbed complicated material without effort. Her professors assumed she came from an ordinary background since she dressed plainly, walked everywhere, and never once mentioned a family name that might have explained the ease with which she understood markets, contracts, and leverage. None of them knew that Emily's silence wasn't shyness at all. It was training, and it had been drilled into her since she was a child, sitting quietly at the edge of boardrooms most people never got to see. It was a Tuesday evening in October when Jack Sullivan first sat down across from her in the library, setting 2 cups of coffee on the table between them like an offering. He introduced himself with the easy confidence of a man who had rarely, if ever, heard the word no, and asked if he could borrow her notes from that morning's macroeconomics lecture. Emily studied him for a long moment before answering. He wore an expensive watch and a tailored jacket on a night when most students showed up in sweatpants, and there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of private schools and family expectations rather than scholarships and part-time jobs. She told him she didn't remember seeing him in class, and he laughed, saying that was because she actually paid attention while the rest of the room tried not to fall asleep. She didn't correct him. She simply let him sit down. That first conversation stretched into a second, and then a third, until study sessions in the library became something closer to routine. Jack always arrived with coffee, and it was always the exact order Emily had mentioned once in passing weeks earlier, which told her he had been paying far more attention than his casual manner suggested. He talked about his family's real estate company, the way someone talks about a beautiful old house with a crumbling foundation, proud of what it used to represent and frustrated by what it seemed to be losing. Emily offered quiet observations here and there, insights that came from a lifetime of watching her own father manage negotiations far larger than anything Jack had ever encountered, but she always framed them as theory, as things she had picked up from a textbook rather than a childhood. Jack listened to her the way some men listen to a woman they find attractive, and the way other men listen to a resource they haven't yet figured out how to use, and Emily noticed, even then, that his attention carried both qualities at once. Months passed, and the relationship deepened in the slow, ordinary way that real connections often do, built out of long walks across campus and longer conversations about where their lives might eventually lead. But even in those early months, Emily began noticing the particular shape of Jack's ambition, the way his sentences about the future almost always circled back to what her mind might be able to do for him rather than what the two of them might build side by side. The first time he took her hand outside her modest apartment building in a neighborhood that was safe but unmistakably working class, he told her she was going to change his life, not their life together, his life specifically. Emily noticed the phrasing immediately, filed it away without reaction, and told herself it was simply the way ambitious men sometimes talked when they were excited, a habit rather than a warning. She wanted, more than she wanted to admit even to herself, for it to be nothing at all. It was 3 years into the relationship when Emily finally called her parents from her small apartment, alone for once, while Jack attended what he had described dismissively as a family obligation he didn't feel like explaining. Her father's face filled the laptop screen, and Emily watched him take in the modest furniture behind her, the small kitchen, the entire quiet performance of an ordinary life she had committed herself to so completely over the past 3 years. Her mother asked her to describe Jack, and Emily did, talking about his intelligence, his drive, the way he claimed to value her thinking above everything else about her. She mentioned, almost proudly, that he had never once asked about money, never questioned why a scholarship student seemed so comfortable discussing complicated business strategy on a random Tuesday night. Her father listened without interrupting a single word, and when she finished speaking, he asked only one question. "Does he know who you actually are?" "No," Emily admitted, feeling the words settle strangely in her chest. "He believes I'm here purely on merit, from an ordinary family, and that part happens to be true. I've simply never corrected the rest of what he assumes." Her father's expression shifted into something Emily recognized instantly from childhood, the same still, calculating look she had watched cross his face during negotiations that decided the fate of entire companies. "Don't tell him yet," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth from a moment earlier. "Let me look into something first." When Emily asked what exactly he meant by that, her father told her simply that if Jack loved her for the right reasons, nothing about him would need to be tested at all. But if her father was right about what he already suspected, then Emily deserved to know the truth about the man she was planning to spend her life with before she gave him anything more of herself than she already had. 6 months after that phone call, Emily stood on the steps of Ashbrook University in her graduation gown, diploma in hand, watching Jack pose for photographs with his family while his father dominated every nearby conversation about future plans and company trajectories. She had maintained her performance flawlessly through 4 years of college, playing the role of the humble scholarship student, the brilliant girlfriend from a modest background who had earned every inch of her degree through effort alone. Her own parents had sent flowers with a card that read simply, "Proud of you, see you soon," but they hadn't attended the ceremony in person. It was too risky, her father had explained gently. One photograph of Thomas Carter standing beside his daughter could unravel 4 years of careful, deliberate silence before whatever her father was planning had a chance to play out completely. That evening, Jack took her to a restaurant that overlooked the entire city skyline, and Emily knew what was coming the moment he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Emily Carter," he said, opening a velvet box to reveal a ring that was beautiful without being extravagant, exactly the kind of ring a man might choose for a woman he believed came from ordinary means. "You've made me better these past 4 years," he told her, smarter, more strategic, more capable of seeing angles I would have missed entirely on my own. "I want you standing beside me while we build something extraordinary together. Will you marry me?" Emily looked down at the ring and then up at his face, searching for something that felt like genuine love rather than calculation, and she found something else entirely, something she couldn't quite name in that moment, but recognized instinctively as incomplete. "Yes," she said anyway, because the test her father had spoken of wasn't finished yet, and because some quiet, stubborn part of her still needed absolute certainty before she allowed herself to believe the worst. 2 weeks later, Jack drove her out to the Sullivan family estate for dinner, and the mansion rose out of its manicured grounds like a monument built specifically to remind visitors of everything they didn't have. White columns lined a wide entrance, gardens stretched in every direction with mathematical precision, and Jack squeezed Emily's hand as they climbed the marble front steps, telling her to just be herself, that his family was going to love her immediately. But the moment his mother opened the front door, Emily saw the assessment happening behind her eyes, quick and clinical, already measuring her and finding her wanting before a single word had been exchanged between them. Dinner unfolded like an interrogation, dressed carefully in the language of polite conversation. They sat around a table long enough to seat 20 people, though only 6 chairs were occupied that evening, and Emily felt every question probing gently for a weakness her hosts were certain existed somewhere beneath the surface. Jack's father, Robert Sullivan, began by asking about her family background while cutting into his steak with the kind of surgical precision that suggested he had rehearsed the question in advance. Emily kept her voice steady and appropriately humble as she explained that her father worked in investments and her mother served on the board of a logistics company. Every word of it was technically true. She simply left out that her father's portfolio included holdings worth billions, and that her mother's seat on those boards came with considerably more influence than the phrase board member usually implied to strangers hearing it for the first time. "How nice," Jack's mother said, offering a smile that never once reached her eyes across the table. "And your parents are comfortable with this engagement," she added, in a tone that made the question sound more like a formality than genuine curiosity. Jack's sister, Megan, leaned forward with an expression of false interest and asked exactly where Emily's parents lived, which neighborhood, which street. Emily named a solidly middle-class area, respectable enough to avoid suspicion, but certainly nothing that would impress anyone seated at that particular table, and she watched the family exchange glances that spoke volumes without a single word needing to be said aloud. The evening continued in that same register for nearly 2 hours, condescension wrapped carefully in the language of manners, questions designed less to learn about Emily than to confirm what the Sullivan family had already decided about her before she ever walked through their front door. When dinner finally ended, Jack's mother suggested that Emily might want to freshen up before dessert, directing her toward a bathroom on the far side of the enormous house. Emily took her time, already certain of exactly what conversation was unfolding in the dining room she had just left behind, and she was right about every part of it. The moment Emily disappeared down the hallway, Robert Sullivan turned to his son with barely contained frustration, saying flatly that she wasn't their caliber, that Sullivan simply didn't marry down, not for love, not for anything. Jack's mother added, in a voice gone suddenly cold, that Emily seemed like a perfectly nice young woman, but that nice didn't pay bills or maintain the kind of social standing their family had spent generations building. Megan nodded along in agreement, asking what their friends would think, what the company's board would think, once word got around about who Jack had chosen to marry. Jack leaned forward at that point, and something shifted into his voice, the same tone he used during business negotiations when he wanted a room to actually listen to him. He told his family to hear what he was actually saying, that Emily wasn't simply some girl he happened to be dating. She was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, at the very top of their graduating class, a full scholarship student with the kind of strategic mind that noticed opportunities everyone else in a room consistently missed. "That's wonderful for her," his mother said dismissively, but nothing. Jack cut through the objection before she could finish it. Her analytical skills, her ability to read markets and predict where they were heading, she's an asset. A genuine asset to Sullivan Properties if we bring her into the company the right way. I've personally watched her solve problems in minutes that our entire strategy team couldn't crack in weeks of meetings. Robert paused at that, real interest flickering across his features for the first time all evening. "You're saying she's useful?" he asked slowly, testing the word the way he might test a business proposal. "I'm saying she could be the difference between this company simply staying afloat and this company actually dominating our sector for the next decade," Jack answered, his confidence building with every sentence. "Think of it less as a marriage and more as an acquisition," he continued. "We wouldn't just be gaining a daughter-in-law. We'd be gaining a genuine competitive advantage, one that costs us nothing beyond a wedding and a ring she already has on her finger." The room fell quiet as his parents exchanged a long look, visibly recalculating everything they thought they understood about the evening. "She'd work for the company then?" his father asked, "her strategies, her thinking, all of it available to us?" Jack smiled, sensing the shift in the room before his mother even spoke again. "Think of it as an acquisition," he repeated. "We're not just getting a daughter-in-law. We're getting a competitive advantage that most companies would pay a fortune for and never actually receive." When Emily returned to the table a few minutes later, everyone was smiling again, cordial if not exactly warm, and she understood immediately that some decision had been reached in her absence. though she couldn't yet name exactly what it was. Jack drove her home that night looking deeply satisfied with himself, and Emily played the role of the relieved fiancée perfectly, the way she had played every role required of her for the past 4 years. Over the following weeks, wedding preparations began in earnest, venues booked, invitations designed and ordered, a date set for exactly 6 weeks out. When Jack eventually asked why he still hadn't met her parents in person after 4 years together, Emily deployed the excuse she had prepared carefully in advance. They were traveling overseas for a major work project that couldn't be postponed, she explained, but they would absolutely be there for the wedding itself, without fail, and in the meantime, they trusted her judgment completely regarding every decision. Jack seemed perfectly content with that arrangement, which told Emily more about his true priorities than any direct conversation ever could have. There was a night, roughly 2 weeks before the wedding, when Jack asked her directly, sitting across a candlelit table at the same restaurant where he had proposed, why her parents had remained so distant throughout the entire planning process, why he had never once been invited to meet them face to face in 4 full years of dating. For one long, suspended moment, Emily nearly told him everything. She nearly said her father's actual name out loud and watched it land across his face the exact same way it had landed on investors, rivals, and strangers her entire life. The truth sat right behind her teeth, close enough to almost taste, and some tired, hopeful part of her wanted desperately to simply let it out and see what happened next. But something in the way Jack was watching her in that moment, patient and expectant, already quietly calculating what her answer might eventually be worth to him, made her swallow the truth back down one final time. She repeated the excuse about the overseas project, and Jack accepted it easily, without a single follow-up question, and Emily understood with a small, cold certainty that he had never actually been curious about her family at all. He had only ever been curious about what more she might eventually be worth to him. During those same final weeks of planning, Emily's college roommate, Rachel, tried more than once to voice a concern she had been carrying quietly for years. Rachel had watched the relationship unfold from the very beginning, had seen the way Jack's questions about Emily's family always circled back to money and connections rather than genuine curiosity about who her parents actually were as people. Over coffee one afternoon, less than a month before the wedding, Rachel finally said it plainly, telling Emily that she had never once heard Jack ask about her childhood, her memories, the small ordinary details people usually want to know about someone they love completely. She only ever heard him ask what Emily's family could offer, phrased in a dozen different polite ways across 4 years. Emily listened, and some part of her recognized the truth in what her friend was saying, but she brushed it aside gently, telling Rachel that Jack simply wasn't a sentimental person, that his mind worked in strategy rather than nostalgia, and that this didn't make him incapable of real love. Rachel didn't push further that day, though the worry never fully left her face, and she would think back on that conversation many times in the months that followed the wedding. Emily's own mother had voiced something similar during a quiet phone call 2 weeks before the ceremony, asking gently whether Emily was truly certain about the life she was choosing, or whether she had simply grown comfortable inside a role she had been playing for so long that stepping out of it felt more frightening than staying inside it. Emily had answered honestly that she didn't fully know anymore, that 4 years of careful performance had blurred the line between the woman she actually was and the woman Jack believed he was marrying. Her mother reminded her softly that her father's plan would reveal the truth soon enough, one way or another, and that whatever happened at that altar would finally answer a question Emily had been too afraid to ask directly for far too long. Emily had hung up the phone that night feeling a strange, quiet calm settle over her, the particular calm that comes just before something long delayed finally arrives. That same week, entirely unknown to Emily at the time, her father placed a phone call that would set everything in motion far sooner than either of them expected. He reached out to Robert Sullivan directly, introducing himself only as a businessman with a significant proposition that could transform Sullivan Properties entirely, without mentioning any personal connection whatsoever. Robert, who had spent the better part of the last year quietly drowning in debt, he had successfully hidden from his own family, agreed to a meeting within the hour, practically desperate for whatever opportunity might be on the other end of that call. Neither man yet understood, in that first exchange, exactly what the other one already knew. Robert Sullivan spent the 72 hours leading up to that meeting researching Thomas Carter obsessively, and every single search result made his hands shake, with a mixture of genuine fear and desperate hope in equal measure. Carter's holdings stretched across real estate, technology, manufacturing, and financial services, an empire so vast and so deliberately quiet that most people had no idea it all traced back to one man who almost never gave interviews and rarely, if ever, took meetings in person. The meeting itself was set for a private office downtown, on neutral territory that Carter's team had specified without room for negotiation. Robert arrived 15 minutes early, wearing his best suit and carrying a portfolio of Sullivan Properties' most impressive projects, though he suspected privately that Carter's people had already conducted due diligence far deeper than anything he could possibly present in a single folder. Thomas Carter entered the room at exactly 11 o'clock, flanked by two composed men who carried themselves with the quiet competence of serious security professionals rather than ordinary assistants. He was tall, controlled, and moved with the kind of unspoken authority that never needed to announce itself to anyone in the room. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, offering a firm handshake and a measuring gaze that seemed to take in far more than Robert was comfortable revealing. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice. The honor is entirely mine," Robert answered, doing his best to keep the desperation out of his voice. "I understand you have a proposition for us." Carter sat down, and somehow the simple act of sitting made him seem to own the entire room despite the office technically belonging to neither of them. "I'm consolidating several commercial development projects along the East Coast," he explained. "The total contract value comes to approximately $10 billion across 5 years, and I need a company with your family's legacy and local connections to manage the execution properly." Robert's heart pounded against his ribs as the number settled fully into his understanding. $10 billion wasn't simply an opportunity. It was resurrection for a company he had watched slowly bleeding out for years behind closed doors. "That's an extraordinary opportunity, Mr. Carter," he managed to say, keeping his composure with visible effort. "Sullivan Properties would be deeply honored to." "There's a condition," Carter interrupted, his tone never changing even as something in the room's atmosphere shifted noticeably. "My daughter," he continued. "She's 26, brilliant and accomplished, though somewhat sheltered given her position in our family. She happened to see a photograph of your son among the preliminary materials my team compiled while reviewing your company. She's expressed genuine interest in meeting him." The words hung in the air while Robert's mind raced through every possible implication and complication at once. "Your daughter wants to meet Jack?" he asked carefully. "More than meet him," Carter clarified. "She would like a genuine chance at building a real relationship with him, assuming they're actually compatible." "I'm a protective father, Mr. Sullivan. My daughter's happiness matters to me more than almost anything else in my life. This contract is contingent on your son giving her that chance honestly." Robert stood as the meeting concluded, his mind already racing ahead to the conversation he would need to have with his son. "May I have some time to discuss this properly with Jack?" he asked. "You have 48 hours," Carter answered simply. "If he's genuinely interested, we'll arrange an introduction. If not," he added with an elegant, final shrug, "I'll find another company capable of managing the development, and my daughter will find another young man to take an interest in instead." They shook hands once more, and Robert left the building in a daze, phone already in hand before he even reached the parking garage. Jack answered on the second ring, asking eagerly how the meeting had gone. "Get home now," Robert told him. "We need to talk immediately. This is the opportunity I've been praying for, but it comes with a very specific condition, one that involves you making a difficult choice about Emily." Jack was already packing near the study window with restless energy by the time his father arrived home, sensing that something significant was unfolding even before Robert began to explain. "Sit down," Robert said, pouring himself a scotch with hands that still hadn't fully steadied. What I'm about to tell you changes absolutely everything for this family." He explained the meeting in careful detail, watching his son's expression shift from confusion into genuine disbelief, and then into something closer to hunger as the number $10 billion registered fully. "That's incredible," Jack said, standing up with visible energy crackling through him. "When do we start? What's the timeline?" "There's a condition," Robert said again, his tone shifting deliberately. "His daughter saw your photograph. She's interested in you romantically, and Carter wants you to give her a genuine chance." The room went completely silent, except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "I'm engaged to Emily," Jack said carefully, testing the words as he spoke them. "I know," his father answered, swirling the scotch slowly in his glass. "Carter knows too, but think strategically for just one moment. We agreed to support your marriage to Emily because of what she brings to this family, her intelligence, her strategic thinking, her potential value to the company long term." "Correct," Jack admitted. "But now there's an option on the table that brings all of that same value, plus a $10 billion contract, plus a direct connection to one of the wealthiest families in the entire country, plus resources that could elevate the Sullivan name beyond anything we've achieved across 3 full generations." Robert leaned forward across the desk. "Son, I'm not telling you what to do here. I'm asking you to think seriously about which path actually serves this family's future better in the long run." Jack turned away from his father, gripping the back of a nearby chair. "What about Emily?" he asked quietly. "We're already planning a wedding. Her parents are supposedly coming. The invitations have already gone out to 200 people, and weddings get called off sometimes," Robert answered matter-of-factly. "It happens more often than people admit. Carter's daughter represents an opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime, if that. Emily is smart, certainly, but she's also fundamentally ordinary, from an ordinary background with ordinary connections. She'll recover eventually and find someone better suited to her actual station in life." The words hung in the study air, and Robert watched his son's face carefully, tracking the internal calculation playing out behind his eyes in real time. "What exactly are you suggesting I do?" Jack finally asked. Robert set his glass down with deliberate care before answering. "Continue the wedding preparations exactly as planned," he said. "Keep Emily comfortable and completely unsuspecting right up until the ceremony itself. Then, at the altar, in front of every single guest, you end it publicly and decisively. Make it unmistakably clear that she was never truly at your level, that this entire relationship was a mistake you're correcting just in time, before it becomes permanent and far more costly to undo." "You want me to humiliate her in front of 200 people?" Jack asked, and Robert noticed that his son's voice carried genuine shock, though notably not outright refusal. "I want you to make a clean, public break that protects this family's reputation completely," Robert answered. "If you quietly cancel the wedding, people will speculate endlessly about what went wrong, what scandal we're hiding behind closed doors. But if you end things decisively at the altar itself, making clear that you realized her unsuitability just in time, then we're the ones who dodged something dangerous. Our reputation stays fully intact, and we remain completely free to pursue the Carter connection without any lingering complications." "That's brutal, Dad," Jack said, though his voice had already lost most of its earlier resistance. "That's simply business," Robert answered, moving around the desk to place a hand on his son's shoulder. "And honestly, did you ever truly love her, or did you love what she consistently did for you these past 4 years?" The pause before Jack answered stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. "She's been useful," he finally admitted. "Genuinely important to my success throughout university and beyond." "Exactly," Robert said, "useful. But Carter's daughter represents something transformative on an entirely different scale. I know this feels difficult right now, son, but in 10 years, when you're running an actual empire instead of simply struggling to maintain a fading legacy, you'll understand clearly that this was the only real choice available to you." Jack stared down at the floor for a long moment, his jaw working silently, before finally looking back up with a decision visible in his eyes, the same cold, deliberate calculation his father had made countless times throughout his own career. "All right," he said quietly, "we continue with the wedding exactly as planned. I'll handle Emily at the altar myself. We'll make it clean and completely public. Then we move forward with the Carter opportunity together." "Good man," Robert said, squeezing his son's shoulder with visible pride and relief flooding through him simultaneously. I'll send word to Carter that you're genuinely interested in meeting his daughter, that you'll be fully available once you've properly handled your prior commitment. When do I actually meet her? Jack asked. After the wedding, Robert answered. Once Emily has been dealt with completely, we'll arrange a proper introduction between you and Carter's daughter right away. After Jack left the study that evening, Robert sat down at his desk and composed a careful message to Thomas Carter, explaining that his son was deeply honored by the daughter's interest and eager to meet her personally. He mentioned only that a prior engagement required resolution first, but assured Carter that Jack would handle it definitively at the upcoming wedding ceremony, after which he would be completely free to pursue a relationship with Carter's daughter without any remaining obligations. Robert hit send and felt real satisfaction settle warm through his chest, the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had just executed a strategic, profitable, and thoroughly clean decision. The response arrived within 5 minutes. Understood, it read simply, "My daughter and I will attend the wedding personally to witness the resolution. Afterward, we can proceed together. The contract will be finalized pending the successful conclusion of these personal matters." Robert read the message twice, a brief flicker of surprise passing through him at the idea of Carter wanting to personally attend, but he told himself it was simply a man wanting to witness his future son-in-law handle difficulty with visible grace under pressure. "Fair enough," he responded. "We would be honored by your presence at the ceremony." What Robert Sullivan didn't know, what he genuinely couldn't have known given how carefully the truth had been guarded for 4 consecutive years, was that Thomas Carter was, in fact, the father of Emily Carter, the same young woman his son was actively preparing to humiliate publicly at the altar in front of 200 unsuspecting witnesses. 1 week later, the cathedral looked exactly like everything Emily had once dreamed her wedding might become. White roses cascaded down every marble column, sunlight poured through stained glass windows in long, colored streams, and 200 guests waited eagerly to witness what Emily still believed, right up until the final moments, would be the happiest day of her entire life. She stood in the bridal suite adjusting her veil, her heart full of nervous excitement despite months of carefully suppressed doubt, telling herself repeatedly that everything she felt was simply ordinary wedding day nerves and nothing more serious than that. Her parents had finally arrived that same morning, though they seemed strangely tense throughout their brief greeting, insisting they would meet her directly at the cathedral rather than riding over together as originally planned. When the processional music finally began, Emily walked the long aisle completely alone, exactly as she had planned it months earlier, her eyes finding Jack waiting at the altar ahead of her. But something in his expression as she approached made her stomach twist with sudden unease, something that felt nothing like love or joy, something cold that she couldn't immediately identify or explain away. When she finally reached him and took both his hands in hers, she found them ice cold despite the warm cathedral air surrounding them. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice echoing gently through the vaulted stone space above them, and Emily tried repeatedly to catch Jack's eyes, searching desperately for some flicker of reassurance. Instead, she found him looking past her entirely, toward his family seated in the front row, as though silently seeking permission for something he had already fully decided to do regardless of her presence beside him. Then, without warning, everything shattered completely. "Actually, I need to stop this," Jack said, pulling his hands away from hers, his voice carrying clearly across the silent cathedral for everyone present to hear. "I can't marry you, Emily." The words struck her like physical blows, one after another. What she managed to say, her mind refusing to process what was actually happening in front of 200 witnesses. "You're not right for this family," he continued, his tone shifting into something almost casual despite the cruelty of what he was saying. "You never really were. Let's just be honest with each other finally. You're beneath our level entirely. I was using you for your intelligence, your strategic thinking, but I've found a considerably better opportunity now, and I don't need what you have to offer anymore." Emily's mind went completely blank with shock as the words settled over her. "Jack, what are you?" she started to ask, but his mother was already rising from the front row, her voice dripping with open contempt. "Did you honestly think you belonged here?" she asked loudly enough for the entire cathedral to hear clearly. "Look at yourself. Pathetic. We've been laughing about you for months without you ever once noticing, Jack's sister added, standing as well with visible satisfaction on her face. The scholarship girl, who genuinely thought she could marry into a family like ours. The humiliation escalated quickly from cutting words into something considerably more physical and vicious. Insults arrived from every direction at once, laughter echoing endlessly off the cathedral's ancient stone walls. Jack's entire family surrounding her now like they had been waiting patiently for this exact moment for years. Someone dumped ice water directly over her head from behind, and Emily gasped as shock and betrayal stole the breath entirely from her lungs, cold liquid soaking immediately through her expensive dress and running down her back. Another guest, one of the bridesmaids Emily had considered a friend just moments earlier, poured champagne slowly down her spine while Jack's family laughed openly at the sight. "This is exactly what happens when you forget your place," Jack's father announced loudly to the stunned crowd, as though delivering some kind of public service announcement rather than orchestrating cruelty. Jack grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a bruise, his face twisted now with open contempt he had clearly been hiding successfully for years. "You were always just useful, Emily," he said. "A tool for this company, nothing more than that, but I genuinely don't need you anymore." He shoved her hard enough that she stumbled backward and fell to her knees on the unforgiving marble floor beneath her ruined dress. Emily knelt there in complete devastation, water and champagne still dripping steadily from her hair, her mind struggling desperately to process that the man she had loved faithfully for 4 full years was now destroying her deliberately in front of every single person she knew. Tears blurred her vision completely as her chest tightened with a pain that felt almost physical in its intensity. This couldn't possibly be real, she thought over and over. This couldn't actually be happening to her, not after everything, not after 4 years of careful devotion and quiet sacrifice on her part. Then, without warning, the massive cathedral doors exploded open behind her. The sound cracked through the stone space like sudden thunder, and Emily looked up through her tears to see 3 figures entering together, 2 people flanked by several men in dark suits, whose composed presence seemed to drop the temperature of the entire room instantly. Her parents. They walked down the long aisle together with terrible, focused purpose, her father's face carved from something that looked almost like ice, her mother's eyes blazing with a fury Emily had genuinely never witnessed from either of them before in her entire life. The security details spread out silently along the sides of the cathedral with practiced military precision. Every sound in the building died at once. Every guest froze completely in place. Emily stared up at her approaching parents in total confusion, still kneeling, still struggling desperately to understand why everyone around her had suddenly gone so completely silent, why Jack's face had drained of all color so quickly it looked like someone had simply pulled a plug somewhere behind his eyes. "Dad," Emily's voice broke completely on the single word. "Mom, what's happening right now?" Her father reached her first, and his expression as he looked down at his own daughter kneeling in a destroyed wedding dress, humiliated and visibly broken in front of 200 strangers, was the single most frightening thing Emily had ever witnessed on his face in her entire life. He helped her stand gently, protectively, then turned slowly to face the Sullivan family directly. "My name is Thomas Carter," he said, his voice quiet, controlled, and absolutely deadly beneath its calm surface. "And you have all just made the single worst mistake of your entire lives." Recognition crashed through the cathedral like a physical wave moving through the crowd. Robert Sullivan's legs actually buckled beneath him as the realization hit fully. Jack stood completely frozen, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the modest, middle-class father Emily had described consistently for 4 straight years, with the towering, controlled billionaire now standing directly in front of him. "Emily is my daughter," Thomas continued, pulling out his phone with one steady hand while keeping his other arm wrapped protectively around Emily's still trembling shoulders. "My only daughter, and I just personally watched every single one of you assault her, humiliate her, and discard her like something worthless in front of 200 witnesses." He made a single phone call right there in front of the entire stunned crowd, his voice carrying easily through the silent cathedral. "I want the Sullivan Company formally bankrupt within 30 minutes, he said simply, before ending the call and turning his attention back to Robert with visible contempt. "You gambled my daughter's entire future for a contract you were never actually going to receive," he said. "Congratulations on that particular decision." Then he nodded once toward the back of the cathedral, and several police officers, who had apparently been waiting quietly near the entrance, stepped forward immediately, moving toward the Sullivan family with handcuffs already prepared in hand. "You're all under arrest for assault," one officer announced clearly to the stunned crowd. The Sullivan family erupted into visible panic almost instantly, begging and pleading, and desperately trying to explain themselves to anyone who might still be listening. Jack reached toward Emily one final time, his face suddenly desperate in a way it had never been throughout their entire 4-year relationship. "Emily, please," he said. "I didn't know. If I had known who you actually were." Emily looked at him through tears that had finally begun to slow. This man who had claimed to love her for 4 consecutive years, who had valued her only for what she could quietly provide him, who had destroyed her publicly the moment he believed he'd found something better waiting elsewhere. "That's exactly the problem," she said quietly, her voice steadier now than she expected it to be. "You only care now because of who my father happens to be. Everything you just did back there, that's actually who you really are underneath everything else." Her mother pulled her close protectively as police officers led the entire Sullivan family away in handcuffs, their protest still echoing faintly through the ancient cathedral walls behind them. The remaining guests sat in complete stunned silence throughout, phones already out, quietly recording everything unfolding in front of them for reasons Emily couldn't begin to process in that moment. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," her mother whispered gently against her ruined hair. "Your father suspected something was wrong for a long time, so he arranged a proper test. We never wanted you to actually go through something like this, not for a single moment." Emily watched Jack being led away in handcuffs, watched his family's entire empire beginning to crumble in real time right in front of her, watched everything they had built so carefully on arrogance and casual cruelty finally turning completely to dust. She had genuinely loved him once. She had trusted him completely. And he had shown her, in the space of a few devastating minutes, exactly what that love had actually been worth to him all along. "Take me home," she finally whispered to her parents, and as the 3 of them walked slowly out of the cathedral together, Emily allowed herself one final look back at the ruins of what should have been her wedding day, destroyed flowers scattered across the marble floor, shocked guests still frozen in their seats, police officers moving methodically through the space, and a family finally learning the hard way that certain people should never be underestimated or betrayed, regardless of how ordinary they might initially appear. In the months that followed, Emily rebuilt her life slowly and deliberately, stepping fully into the world she had spent 4 years quietly hiding from the man she had once believed she would marry. She eventually took a leading role within her father's company, applying the exact strategic thinking Jack had once called an asset, except now it belonged entirely to her own future rather than serving someone else's ambition. The Sullivan family's company never recovered from that single morning in the cathedral, its reputation and its finances both collapsing within the same year under the combined weight of criminal charges and the sudden, total withdrawal of Carter Holdings from every prior arrangement. Years later, when people occasionally asked Emily about that particular chapter of her life, she rarely spoke about the humiliation itself in any real detail. Instead, she spoke about the lesson underneath it, the simple, enduring truth that genuine character reveals itself most clearly in the moments when someone believes they have absolutely nothing left to gain from treating another person with basic decency and respect. She often said that the version of herself who knelt on that cold marble floor had been given something valuable buried inside something devastating, a permanent, unshakable clarity about which people in her life valued her for who she actually was rather than for what she could quietly provide them behind the scenes. Emily Carter's story is ultimately a reminder that humility, respect, and genuine love should never depend on someone's bank account or their family name, no matter how convincing the performance of affection might initially seem. Treating other people with basic dignity isn't simply the morally right thing to do. It's also the wisest possible choice available to any of us, because none of us ever truly know who is actually standing in front of us or what they've quietly chosen not to reveal about themselves just yet. Have you ever been underestimated by someone because of where you came from or because of what people assumed about your life without ever bothering to ask you directly? We would genuinely love to hear your own story in the comments below. And if this video moved you even a little, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one when it arrives.